You have made your quilt and the layers have all been assembled, and now you are going to machine quilt it using regular straight stitch. And you set off doing that and it's kind of going okay, but then you realise that the work isn't feeding very evenly and you are getting long and short stitches. What can you do to help you get more even stitches? I do think this is quite a big question really, and there is no one thing that is really going to help you. But I'm going to give you some pointers and see if we can make a difference, a positive difference for you. Now, you can probably see that my sewing machine here is set down into my sewing machine table, and that does make a very big difference because it means that the work is supported kind of fairly flat on the sewing machine table, and it doesn't have to kind of come up to be able to be fed through and under the needle. So that support is really helpful and it does make a big difference. And what you can also do is when you are putting your work on the table and you are starting to sew, don't have the work spread out flat on your table. Have it fairly bunched up and light so that there is movement. You can imagine, can't you, that if it's a big piece and it's quite heavy and it's all laid out flat, that is going to struggle to be fed through as opposed to something that is a bit lighter because it's bunched up a bit and so it's not that big immovable piece. So that can make a difference to you. And I would say pause often and rearrange the work so that you can give that quilt the best chance of feeding through the sewing machine. So what you need to do if you've got it is make sure that you engage your needle down function. That means every time you stop sewing, your needle will go down into the work and then your work is held in position. You can pause, stand up if you need to, rearrange it, and when you set off sewing again, you're not going to get a judder in that line of stitching. I am always quite intrigued when ladies and gentlemen, of course, have machines with needle down function and they don't engage it. I think it's invaluable, and there are few occasions when you don't have that function engaged. So that's the first thing to say on that. Now, the foot that you are using can make a difference. I do think that if you can use a foot that has a kind of opening to the front so there isn't metal bar across it that obscures your visibility at the needle point, that is very helpful because it enables you to see where you're actually sewing much better. But there are other feet that you can choose than the regular, normal, just ordinary sewing foot, and that is there's a walking foot. Now, a walking foot helps to grab hold of the work and take it through the sewing machine. So if you look at your sewing machine, just your regular sewing machine, and underneath the foot are what are called the feed dogs, and if you run your finger, make sure the machine's off, underneath the foot, you will feel those little teeth, those feed dogs, and they take the bottom layer, they kind of grab it and walk it through. But what often happens is the top layer gets pushed the other way. You've seen that when you've sewn a long seam and the two pieces of fabric were exactly the same length, and then when you get to the end, the top layer is hanging over a bit. Well, what the walking foot does, it kind of grabs the top layer in a similar way to how the feed dogs grab the underneath layer, and so it helps everything to move through much more easily. And some machines have a built-in walking foot and it's called dual feed, and that is great because you don't have to go to the trouble of attaching a separate foot. You can just engage that particular function on your sewing machine. So experiment with the feet that you actually have, you know, see which gives you the best visibility, see if one foot feeds better than another, and if you don't have one, it might be worthwhile looking into purchasing a walking foot if you do a lot of that kind of work. And then just a couple of other things to say are that the stitch length can make a difference. So my suggestion is don't have your stitch length too short. I would have it at stitch length number 3 or even longer than that, because that will help the work to feed through. So a longer stitch length helps the work to feed through more easily, and of course you will get that stitched a little bit more quickly. Not that you should be rushing in any way, you should be taking your time. So that can make a difference. And then the other thing I'm going to say is when you are stitching with any type of foot, what often can happen is that you get lumpy areas as you're sewing along. So for example, you might be on a section of the quilt where there's no piecing, there are no seams, there's no joins, and the work moves easily across those. And then when you hit a seam, there's a lot of lumpiness there, and you get small stitches, and the work kind of gets stuck, and then it'll get off that lumpy bit and then go back to the regular stitch length. So there are things that you can do to help with that. One of them is to use a jeans foot, and a jeans foot has more ability to actually ride over lumpier and thicker areas. So if you've got a jeans foot, it might be worth trying that out and see how that works as in terms of feeding the work through the sewing machine. And the other thing I want to say to you is that when I first started my quilting journey, I did press my seams to one side, and I did get that bulk in the seam areas. But these days I tend to press all of my seams open when I'm making my blocks, when I'm doing my piecing, and so the bulk of the seam allowance is distributed more evenly than when you press to one side. So that might be something else that you might like to consider, because it will certainly help you get the work through the sewing machine more easily. So a few pointers there. You may have the tools and the answer already in your accessory box. You may need to spend a little bit of money, but it's worth investigating all of those things to see what makes a difference to you and your work. If you've enjoyed that information and found it interesting, I teach a huge range of quilting classes through quiltersquestiontime.com, starting with a beginner quilters class that takes you through the entire process from start to finish, and Series 1 Quilters Question Time, the transformational series designed to transform your quilting and take your enjoyment and the results that you make to the next level. quiltersquestiontime.com.